Now, as you'd expect, in a day of recollection, I'm going to begin my talk with a prayer, but it's not one that I composed. It's rather a prayer of John Paul II that he prayed at Easter time in the year 2003, just a couple years before his death. And it's on the very theme of my talk today, which is peace. I think that was included in the little advertisement that you received. And John Paul's prayer goes like this. To the Creator of nature and humanity, of truth and beauty, I pray. Hear my voice, for it is the voice of victims, of all wars and violence among individuals and nations. Hear my voice, for it is the voice of children who suffer when people put their faith in weapons of war. Hear my voice when I beg you to instill into the hearts of all humans the wisdom of peace, the strength of justice, and the joy of fellowship. Hear my voice, for I speak for the multitudes in every country and every period of history who do not want war and are ready to walk the road of peace. Hear my voice and grant insight and strength so that we may always respond to hatred with love, to injustice with total dedication to justice, to need with sharing, and to war with peace. O God, hear my prayer and grant the world your everlasting peace. Amen. Obviously a beautiful prayer. And what I'm going to talk about mainly is, first of all, cultivating peace in our own individual lives, but I will conclude with some thoughts that are more in accord with the theme of Pope John Paul II's prayer there about peace in society. I'm sure you're all aware that that single word is the Benedictine motto, in Latin, pax. And it's referred to a number of times in the Rule of St. Benedict. Let me just give you a few examples here. You probably know the Rule of Benedict begins with the prologue and then 73 chapters after it. In the prologue, he regularly quotes a number of the Psalms, including Psalm 34. And here's what Benedict writes. If you desire true and eternal life, keep your tongue from vicious talk and your lips from all deceit. Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. And then just a few chapters later, the chapter 4, entitled The Tools or the Instruments of Good Works, one of them reads as follows. If you have dispute with someone, make peace with him before the sun goes down. And then a few chapters after that, one on how gifts should be distributed or according to the needs of individual monks. Benedict writes, whoever needs less should thank God and not be distressed, but whoever needs more should feel humble because of his weakness, and not self-important because of the kindness shown. In this way, all the members of the community will be at peace. Maybe it's that verse more than any other that gave the word pax the motto of the Benedictine order, because certainly a monastic community is supposed to be a group of people living together in peace and harmony and concern for one another. And then finally, this is also appropriate because you are today our guests. There's a whole chapter on how guests should be received at a monastery. And there, Benedict writes, once a guest has been announced, the superior and brothers are to meet the guest with all the courtesy of love. And first of all, they're to pray together and so be united in peace. The famous monastery in my home state of Kentucky, the Abbey of Gethsemane, in fact, once had, and maybe still has, I haven't been back there in a while, over its main entrance, the Latin term pax intrantibus. And those of you who remember all your Latin from school here know that means peace to those who enter. And you're also, I'm sure, aware that our own school's motto now expands on that theme of peace by adding the words in sapientia, pax in sapientia, meaning peace in wisdom. So it's both the Benedictine motto and then a reference to what should be going on in the school, which is certainly not just learning lots of facts or knowledge, but even more importantly, wisdom, which is, I suppose you could say in a nutshell, how to use that knowledge for the good of others and for the service of God. Anyway, that gives you some sense about why this is an important theme. And you find it not just in the Rule of Benedict, but also, obviously, in the Bible. In fact, it's worth noting, those of you who might be interested in what religious life is all about, I mean consecrated religious life, it's very clear that the main rule of monks and nuns and sisters and brothers is not a particular rule like that of Benedict or Francis or the constitutions of the Society of Jesus. The basic rule is the Bible, the Scriptures. In fact, for centuries, monastic legislators didn't even call what they wrote a rule. For them, regula, rule, was simply the Bible. It was only a bit later, and certainly so by the time of Benedict, that monastic legislation started getting called that. But it's regula only in a secondary sense. And if you look at the Scriptures, our basic rule, again, there's all sorts of important images in there about peace. You think maybe first of all of Isaiah talking about being swords into plowshares, or a bit later in the same prophecy, chapter 32, the Lord saying, "My people will abide in a peaceful dwelling, in secure dwellings and quiet resting places." It's the most urgent desire of Jesus. You hear that not only in the 14th chapter of John's Gospel, but you hear it every time you attend Eucharist. You heard it today from Father Peter just about a half hour ago. That just before communion, the priest prays the words that Jesus says in John's Gospel, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give you." And then it's also worth noting, St. Paul begins the majority of his letters with a reference to peace. For example, very early on in the letter to the Romans, he greets the recipients of that letter and says, "Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ." So this is our hope, our Christian hope, and it's one obviously very needed today. It's needed in world affairs. One thinks only of the civil war in Syria that's been raging now for 2 years and more, and all the yearnings of the people in that part of the world for peace. It's needed here in our own country. We think of the tragedy up at Sandy Hook Elementary School some weeks ago. It's needed in our own metropolitan area, where regularly the newspapers have reports of murders and armed robberies and things like that. And it's needed in our own hearts, in our own lives, in our own families, when in one way or another people have anxiety over their jobs, worries about their children's health, their children's behavior, worries about perhaps a fragile marriage, worries about one's health, and so forth. There's a website that the Benedictine nuns down in Australia have, that I look at every once in a while. It has a very interesting passage about a person not at peace. And here's the way these Benedictine sisters describe such a person. "Anyone who lives with a divided heart is often agitated, preoccupied with worries and cares, often interfering in other people's business, restless, unable to be quiet or even sit quietly. This kind of person is rarely seen in a quiet garden, but is always on the go. Such a person sits down to prayer and immediately remembers there's still some job that has to be done, and done right now. Spends almost every day trying to keep on top of all areas so that nothing's ever out of hand. This kind of person's always telling you how much they want peace, but when it is all around them, they can't cope. It's too quiet, too peaceful." Well, whether or not that describes any aspect of your own life, your own personality, I think we agree that in one way or another we can all live more peaceful lives. And in my talk now, I'm going to talk about 4 ways in which one might cultivate that personally, and then I'll conclude with some broader thoughts about peace in society. First of all, it's important to recognize problems are always going to arise that threaten personal peace and equanimity. It's so important to be convinced no problem could possibly arise that couldn't in one way or another contribute to your own personal growth, no matter how horrendous it is. It might be something painful, might be something embarrassing, might be something truly unjust, might be something that really shouldn't have happened, but it did. And if it did, you have a choice on how you're going to react. And there's always the choice of reacting in a way that will lead to growth and not diminution of who you are. You can always, on the one hand, feel sorry for yourself. On the other hand, and obviously much better, be convinced with St. Paul in that beautiful 8th chapter of Romans that nothing could ever separate us from the love of Christ. Paul writes, neither hardship nor distress, nor persecution, nor nakedness, nor peril, nor the sword. For in all these things we're more than conquerors through him who loved us. It's one thing to believe that, and I trust we all do, but it's also, I think, worth keeping in mind that you just hearing the words or even believing them is sometimes not enough. And in times of great personal distress, you might well have to confide in somebody you trust, somebody who can share the burden. Maybe not even get good advice, but just know that by having a sympathetic ear and unburdening yourself, a lot of good can come from that. And I think it's also worth keeping in mind, I really think it's true, nothing could happen to any of us that other people haven't already had to undergo. You're never alone in any of your problems. And as I said before, it doesn't mean that something shouldn't have happened, but you can still face the problem in a fruitful way. And I'll give you an example. One of the best examples, because it's so sad. I've heard, and I'm sure that if I'd gotten married and been a parent, it would be true for me, that probably the worst thing that could happen to a father or mother is to have one of their children die before them. I remember celebrating the funeral of my college roommate who died of cancer around the age of 40, and the sadness of his mother and father at that ceremony was just unforgettable. I mean, I can still picture the grief on their face on that day. And Joe died of a disease, and nobody was to blame for that. But it's even worse if one's child is murdered. And there is a family I've read about out in Southern California whose daughter was murdered. She had gone a couple decades ago to South Africa to help in voter registration during that country's first all-races election in 1994, when Nelson Mandela was in fact elected president. But as she was helping people get registered, a mob of young men beat her mercilessly and left her for dead. 4 of them were convicted and sentenced to years of hard labor in prison. But then under the guidelines of that country's Reconciliation and Truth Commission, those men applied for amnesty. And there were 3 stipulations to achieve amnesty and therefore release from prison. They had to confess, they had to show that the crime they committed was politically motivated, and they had to apologize to the victim's family. So this dead woman's parents traveled from California to South Africa for the hearing, and on that occasion they told the commission, which was led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, that they would not object to amnesty being granted to these men who had killed their daughter. And the father said, and I quote, "My wife and I hope that the families and communities of these men will gather around them and give them the support necessary to lead productive lives in a nonviolent way. We hope they grow up well. We're not going to waste any time regretting that they've been given a second chance. All we can say is we harbor no grudge. We have no desire for reparations. We're free and at peace. We sleep very well at night." Obviously, a very exemplary response to a tragedy, and I hope that in one way or another, our response could be something like that of that couple. Then the second point about a way in which you might be able to bring some more peace into your own life, and that is to simplify your life by getting rid of things that really aren't necessary. And for that, I'm going to quote a little passage from a pamphlet I picked up probably a couple years ago. Needless to say, as an academic, I've read tons of books, but sometimes the best things come in small packages. And a few years ago, I was over at a spiritual center, not even really Christian, it was a kind of Hindu ashram over in Bethesda, on the outskirts of Bethesda. And they just had on a little table this leaflet called Steps Towards Inner Peace. It was written by a woman who doesn't even give her name. She just calls herself Peace Pilgrim. I looked up on the web and found out that in fact her given name was Mildred Ryder. And she remarkably crossed the country, this country, on foot a number of times, simply being a pilgrim for peace. And what she said on this point about getting rid of what's not necessary, Mildred says, I discovered this great truth. Unnecessary possessions are just unnecessary burdens. Now, I don't mean all of our needs are the same. Yours may be much greater than mine. For instance, if you have a family, as I don't, you would need the stability of a family center for your children. But I do mean that anything beyond need, and sometimes that includes things beyond physical needs, anything beyond needs tends to become burdensome. And I'll give you an example from a giant. I think certainly the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest person of the first half of the 20th century was Mahatma Gandhi, maybe of the whole century. When he died, this man who confronted what was then the greatest empire in the world and got them to leave his country in a nonviolent way, this man had possessions that you could count on the fingers of your two hands. He had a couple eating bowls with a wooden fork and spoon, a letter opener, sandals, spectacles, a watch, because he always thought it was impolite if you arrived late for an appointment. And that was about it. That's all he had. He would regularly give away or auction off any gifts that were ever given to him. And he just experienced incredible freedom by not having all these possessions. Or consider in the Christian tradition, St. Basil, one of the real great saints of the early centuries. He lived at a time when the Roman emperor was an adherent of the Arian heresy and was persecuting church leaders who disagreed with him on that point of doctrine. And at one point, the emperor's prefect of the East threatened Basil with confiscation of his property, with exile, with torture, and death if he didn't renounce his Orthodox faith that Jesus was truly the divine Son of God. Basil's great friend and fellow saint, Gregory of Nazianzen, later wrote a life of Basil, and he tells how Basil replied to that threat. Here's what he said, at least in Gregory's words. Well, in truth, Basil wrote, confiscation means nothing to me who have nothing, unless you covet these wretched garments I wear and a few books, for that's all I possess. As for exile, that means nothing to me, because I'm not attached to any particular place. The house I live in isn't even mine, and I feel at home any place to which I could be sent. Or rather, I regard the whole earth as belonging to God, and consider myself a stranger wherever I am. As for torture, how would you apply it? I don't have a body strong enough to bear it, unless you're thinking of just the first blow you would give me, for that would be the only one you could. And as for my subsequent death, that would be a benefit for me, for it would take me all the sooner to the God for whom I live. Needless to say, the prefect left him alone. There was nothing he could do to a body or to a person who's as free as that. On the other hand, craving things, or even worse, craving persons in a possessive, jealous way, is one of the surest obstacles to inner peace. There's another author that I frequently read. He died a few years ago. Eknath Ishvara is his name. And in one of his books, was entitled Words to Live By, he writes, "It's good to admire beauty, but it's neither good nor practical to want to take beauty home, put it on the mantelpiece, and say, 'Stay there.' And when you see something beautiful, you may want it for yourself. It may be a dramatic house, a lovely flower, or a graceful person. You just want it. But if this wanting becomes a compulsion, it's likely you'll lose what you want so much. Jealousy comes into a relationship whenever we try to possess someone for ourselves. It's a very difficult secret to discover, that when we do not want to possess another person selfishly, when we do not make demand after demand, the relationship will grow and last. But it's something we have to learn the hard way. It's the secret of all relationships, not only between husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend, but between friend and friend, parents and children. Instead of trying to exact and demand, just give more, and give still more." And then thirdly, I would say, to cultivate peace in our own lives, purify our motives and act as far as possible, not for self-aggrandizement, but for service to others. Again, this woman known as Peace Pilgrim, Mildred Ryder, has some helpful words on this, and I think they're especially helpful because they're specific. They deal with a particular person she knew. Whenever I have students write papers, I say, the more specific details you can give, the more effective your writing will be. And here's what she said. "Your motive, if you're to find inner peace, must be an outgoing one of service. I once knew a man who was a good architect. It was obviously his right work, but he was doing it with the wrong motivation. He just wanted to make a lot of money and keep ahead of the Joneses. He worked himself into an illness, and it was shortly after that I met him. I got him to start doing little things to serve others. I talked to him about the joy of service, and I knew that after he had experienced this, he'd never go back into such self-centered living. We corresponded a bit after that, and on the third year of my pilgrimage route, I walked through his town and hardly recognized him when I stopped in to see him. Such a changed man. He was still an architect, so he was drawing up a plan for a family and talked all about it, saying, 'You see, I'm designing it this way in order to fit their budget. And then I'll set it on a plot of ground in this way to make it look really nice.' His motive was simply to be of service to the people to whom he was drawing up his plans. He was now a radiant, transformed person. His wife told me that his business had actually increased because people were now coming to him from miles around for designs for their homes." And then Peace Pilgrim concluded, "I've met a few people who had to change their jobs to change their lives, but I've met many more who merely had to change their motive in order to change their lives." I especially appreciated that story because it reflected something that I myself had written months before I even read this little pamphlet. My piece is in this year's Benedictine yearbook. That's something that our English Benedictine congregation publishes every year. It includes a lot of lists that might not be all that interesting, but there are articles in there, including the one that I wrote and a number of others, that you might enjoy reading. We have some copies of this out in the lobby if you're interested in picking up a copy. They're just $5. But at any rate, I wrote this article because it was sort of based on something I talked to our monks about here in one of my conferences a few months ago. And it's on this theme of service, which I really believe is absolutely central to our Benedictine way of life. If you look carefully at the Rule of Benedict, it's remarkable to see how frequently the language of service appears, whether it be the verb servire, or the noun servitium or servitus, or the other, which means service, are the personal noun servitor, which means servant. He writes in his prologue that he intends to establish a school for the large service. At the beginning of chapter 5, which is on obedience, he says the entire life of a monk should be one of holy service. He thereby understands obedience as serving Christ, just as in his later chapter on how you should receive visiting monks, he says, we are all in service of the same Lord and doing battle for the same King. But just as he often speaks of serving the Lord in various parts of the world, he also talks of serving one another. For example, he says those assigned to kitchen duties are to serve one another in love, just as those who are sent to serve in a separate kitchen for the abbot and guests are, he writes, to perform this service without murmur. In his chapter on caring for the sick brethren, he says, the sick are to be served out of honor for God. And I think all of that, and so many other verses of the Rule of Benedict, simply reflect what Jesus says of himself in Mark's Gospel, I came not to be served, but to serve, to give my life as a ransom for many. Here, we try to do this in the way we treat our students, and I hope that was true of the way you various alumni were treated, helping our students grow not just intellectually, but also emotionally and physically and spiritually. We try to be of service to the people who come here as guests, whether simply to worship with us at a particular service or to spend a few days overnight, trying to receive them, as Benedict says, as you would receive Christ himself. And especially the overnight guests are often remarkably grateful for this. Here's just an example of a man who spent a few days with us a few years ago and later wrote and had this to say. During the 4 days I was at St. Anselm's, I was able to recover my conscience. For those of you who had never pushed your conscience too far, you may not realize what a feat that recovery was. But it wasn't my feat. I didn't recover anything. It was God working carefully and quietly through you who found me and touched my heart, or rather rent it into pieces and reconstructed it in his image. The man who wrote those lines has since made his profession of faith in a parish in the part of the country where he now lives. You may not have the same possibilities of receiving overnight guests regularly in your own homes, but if you can come to treat others as you would want to be treated yourself, or as you would hope to treat Christ, that will surely be one other way of bringing greater peace into your own life. And then fourth and last, as far as this personal peace goes, and as difficult as it may seem, I urge all of us, including myself, to try to cultivate positive feelings even toward people who may have hurt you. Jesus says, as you well know in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the hardest sayings, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And I'm these days teaching in our school a course to our seniors on world religions, and we recently finished looking at Buddhism. One of the basic texts of that tradition is the so-called Dhammapada, and it's arranged in pairs of verses, one on how not to live, and the second of the pair on how one should react. So here's the way it begins. He abused me, he beat me, he vanquished me, he robbed me. Those in whom such thoughts find refuge will never still their wrath. He abused me, he beat me, he vanquished me, he robbed me. Those who deny refuge in any such thoughts will still their wrath. For never in this world is hatred stilled by hatred. It will be stilled only by non-hatred. This is the eternal law. And again, if I might one final time quote this woman who calls herself Peace Pilgrim, She says, "No outward thing, nothing and no one from outside can hurt me inside, psychologically. I have come to recognize I could only be hurt psychologically by my own wrong actions, which I have control over, by my own reactions. They're tricky, but I do have control over them too. Or by my own inaction in some situation that requires action from me. And when I came to recognize all this, how free I felt. I just stopped hurting myself. Now someone could do the meanest thing to me, and I feel deep compassion for this other person who's obviously so out of harmony. This psychologically ill person, capable of doing such mean things. I certainly would not hurt myself by a wrong reaction of bitterness or anger. You do have control over whether or not you'll be hurt psychologically. And anytime you want, you can stop hurting yourself." Well, up to now, I've focused on ways to foster peace in our own lives. Let me conclude by some reflections on the wider society. Now, obviously, some who have done this well were already leaders on the world stage, and so may seem too remote or too exalted to be good examples and inspirations for us. What I think's more valuable is to see how on occasions a person who had been leading a remarkably normal, ordinary life rose to the occasion because of certain circumstances and became a bold, courageous advocate for peace. One of the best examples I know comes from Northern Ireland from the time of the Troubles. They're not completely over, but they've certainly calmed down a lot since the late 1990s. And the person I have in mind is a woman, Mairead Corrigan Maguire. So let me say a bit about her. She was born into a Catholic family in Belfast in 1944 and was therefore in her mid-20s when the worst of the Troubles began in 1969. Like most people in that part of the world, she truly felt sorry for the hundreds who were being killed, but what led her to become actively involved was a particularly tragic incident that affected her own family. In August 1976, her sister Anne was out walking along a road in Belfast with her 8-year-old daughter and her 2 younger sons, the youngest only 6 weeks old. Suddenly, a British Army patrol shot and killed an IRA volunteer as he was driving along that road. The car careened onto the sidewalk, immediately killed all 3 of the children, and seriously injured Mairead's sister. Appalled and deeply grieving her niece and 2 nephews, Mairead joined a woman named Betty Williams who had actually seen this accident, and together they formed a group that came to be called the Community for Peace People. Within just a couple days, they'd acquired or obtained 6,000 signatures on a petition for peace. Just a few days after that, they led a peaceful march of 10,000 Protestant and Catholic women through the city, and that was soon followed by a rally of over 50,000 people, which was the largest peace demonstration ever held in that part of the world. Still other rallies took place later in that year, with perhaps a total of 500,000 people taking part at one time or another. And for their efforts, these 2 women received the Nobel Peace Prize for 1976 and continued working for peace and justice, though no longer jointly. But what I want to emphasize, as I've already mentioned, is that this was just a very ordinary woman, no different from any of us, but she grew immensely precisely through her efforts to do something when she confronted that tragedy in her own family. Looking back on her early involvement, she once very truthfully admitted how really ordinary she was. She says, I remember speaking at a Peace People assembly in the splendid surroundings of the Europa Hotel in Belfast, and my legs going to jelly as I watched the colored lights going on and off in front of me. I was so frightened that I asked my associate, Kieran McCowan, to give the talk instead of me. But he told me I must get up and speak. Hard as those days were for all of us, it was a time of growth for us all. And she's also quite open in speaking about the religious grounding of her work, founded above all in the gospel, but also in the words and example of Gandhi. In an open letter to friends and grassroots leaders in India, marking the 50th anniversary of Gandhi's assassination, she wrote, I believe Gandhi's greatest legacy to both India and humanity was the example of a life filled with the Spirit of God, a life lived in a spirit of nonviolence, a life lived every minute fully alive, in deep awareness of the presence of God in, about, and around us. It was this loving spirit that enabled him to become one of history's greatest prophets and greatest practitioners of nonviolence. And just as Gandhi never shrank from speaking frankly to those who opposed his way of nonviolence, Mered Corrigan Maguire directly challenged the members of the IRA to be true to their Christian heritage. In an open letter to them, published in 1993, she wrote in part, in the Republican movement, you're now faced with the need to change radically, to move away from your so-called armed struggle and into a nonviolent alternative. Your right to political aspiration and national identity has been acknowledged. The way of active nonviolence is in tune with your own Christian roots and heritage. You know that in your heart. As a child, you learned to pray the words, help me to live like Jesus. Jesus with the machine gun is unimaginable. It's time now for a new vision and fresh wisdom. And she likewise took on the head of the Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, after Adams had published a letter in an Irish newspaper defending the use of violence. Her published response a week later was unflinching in its criticism of Adams's stance. Mered wrote, you ask for suggested strategies. If we choose to be Christian before being nationalistic or materialistic, then the question before us is, what strategy would Christ use? Jesus' strategy is love your neighbor as yourself and love your enemies. This means we overcome evil through active nonviolence. We respect the humanity of each person, even if we cannot agree with that person's actions. Our strategy is dialogue, a necessary first step. And it's up to everyone to make this possible. We all need to recognize the possibility that we ourselves can change and our neighbor can also change. I only ask you not to get discouraged in your quest for dialogue with others. Now that woman made a difference in what most people would consider a rather remote part of the world. It's worth considering that we live in or near one of the most important cities of the world, a city that has, among many other organizations, one called the United States Institute for Peace, which, as you may know, is housed in a building of striking architecture down near the Lincoln Memorial. The USIP has a wonderful website, and it regularly offers all sorts of programs about ways in which anyone can promote peace in our world. So I urge you at least to check out the website of the United States Institute for Peace. Perhaps subscribe to their free weekly reminder of upcoming events by email, something I regularly receive. And at least in that way, take even a modest step toward cultivating peace in our world, even as we cultivate it in our individual lives.